Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. I absolutely love digging into how different organizations frame their core missions, and today we've got a really fascinating one to unpack. We are looking at an initiative from the First Liberty Institute. As the U.S. gears up for its big 250th anniversary in 2026, this legal nonprofit has launched a massive campaign. It's called Faith Freedom 250 Years Strong. So what we're going to do today is objectively break down the claims, the specific legal cases, and the really ambitious goals of this campaign, using strictly the materials they've put out themselves. If you want to understand exactly how this major organization is mobilizing around the future of religious liberty, well, you're definitely in the right place. Here's a quick roadmap for our explainer today. We'll cover America's first freedom, the modern challenges they identify, some real legal cases, First Liberty's actual mission, and finally, how they plan on securing the future. All right, let's dive right into Section 1, America's First Freedom, looking at the campaign's historical premise. Okay, so every compelling campaign needs a really strong historical anchor, right? And First Liberty explicitly maps its own mission onto the broader timeline of American history. Now, fun fact, the original framers debated the exact wording of the First Amendment for weeks, but First Liberty actually views 1776 as the true starting point. They point straight to the Declaration of Independence, arguing it established a core principle, that our rights come from a creator, not the government. And they argue this directly shaped the First Amendment, making religious liberty America's absolute fundamental first freedom. Fast forward a bit to the 1990s, and that's when First Liberty begins what they describe as a nearly 30-year legal fight to protect that very freedom. And this all leads us right to 2026, America's 250th anniversary. They're framing this upcoming date as way more than just a birthday party. They see it as a crucial turning point to make sure this foundational freedom survives for the next 250 years. Moving on to part 2, let's look at the modern challenges and the core problem the campaign says we're facing. So the whole campaign essentially pivots on this one central question: is religious freedom actually guaranteed today? And according to First Liberty Institute, their answer is a definitive no. They argue that if we fail to defend this particular freedom, the entire foundation that holds up every other American right is going to weaken and eventually disappear altogether. They are asserting that religious liberty is currently facing unprecedented challenges all over the country. To underscore these threats, the campaign identifies some very specific areas of conflict. They aren't just talking in abstract legal jargon here. They point to real situations, like a teacher being forced to take down a crucifix from her desk, a store manager who was fired over refusing to use preferred pronouns, service members facing dishonorable discharge for skipping the COVID vaccine, and what the source describes as children being pushed toward radical transgender ideology in schools. The narrative First Liberty is building here is really clear. These are not just isolated, one-off incidents. They argue these are prime examples of everyday Americans being forced into an impossible choice between keeping their jobs and keeping their faith. So, what's the proof? Let's transition into part 3, real cases, examining the actual evidence from the courtroom. To back up all those claims about modern challenges, the campaign leans heavily on their actual legal docket. They highlight these prominent, super high-stakes battles to show their impact. Take the comeback coach, for example. This is Joe Kennedy, a former high school football coach. His case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ultimately upheld his right to pray on the field after games. Then, on the flip side, you've got the faithful carrier, Gerald Groff. He was a postal worker who actually lost his job because he observed the Sunday Sabbath. The Supreme Court handed down a unanimous victory in his favor, too. By putting a spotlight on these specific, recognizable wins, the campaign takes these huge, abstract constitutional arguments and grounds them in the everyday lives of regular folks, like a coach and a mailman. But it's not all just massive Supreme Court showdowns. The source material also zooms way in on localized, ongoing struggles. Take Connecticut schoolteacher Marisol Arroyo Castro. According to First Liberty, she was actually threatened with termination simply for displaying a small crucifix near her desk to express her faith. By highlighting a story like this, the campaign is communicating to the viewer that these legal battles aren't just happening in Washington, they're happening right now in local classrooms, directly affecting everyday professionals. And First Liberty expands the scope way beyond schools and post offices. The campaign also points to the military. They cite 35 U.S. Navy SEALs who faced severe threats to their careers just because they chose not to get a vaccine based on their religious convictions. Then, they highlight another case they call criminalizing compassion. This involves a guy named Pastor Chris Avell out in Ohio. He literally faced criminal charges just for keeping his church open 24/7 to minister to his local community. So whether we're talking about elite special forces or a small-town pastor, The organization is using these incredibly varied examples to argue that the threat to religious expression is widespread, hitting practically every sector of American life. That brings us to part 4, First Liberty's mission. We've seen the historical premise and the perceived threats, but what is their actual legal track record? This right here, this number is the absolute cornerstone of their institutional credibility, 11. That is the exact number of Supreme Court cases First Liberty reports winning, all thanks to the support of their donors. Now, to put that into perspective, in the legal world, especially for a nonprofit, reaching the highest court in the land even once is a monumental task. Actually, the Supreme Court accepts less than 2% of the cases it's asked to review, so securing 11 victories, that's the primary piece of data they use to back up their claim of being the largest legal organization in the nation dedicated exclusively to defending religious liberty. But the metrics don't stop there. First Liberty also touts a massive 90% win rate across thousands of clients over their nearly 30-year history, 9 times out of 10. But here is perhaps the most crucial thing they emphasize to their audience. Their clients never see a bill, not a single dime. They represent students, teachers, military heroes, business owners, all of it entirely free of charge, fully funded by donor support. And you can see how this effectively positions the organization as a vital protective shield for regular citizens who, let's be honest, could probably never afford a massive constitutional legal battle on their own. All right, let's head into our final section, securing the future. With that 2026 anniversary looming right around the corner, what is the campaign actually asking people to do? First Liberty emphasizes that we are currently sitting in what they call a narrow governing window. They argue that these windows of opportunity do not last forever, right? Especially when you factor in shifting political dynamics and national elections. So a huge element of their forward-looking strategy involves supporting the President's Religious Liberty Commission. They point out this is the first of its kind, and it's actively preparing recommendations right now to strengthen constitutional protections. The campaign is essentially urging supporters to add their names to this commission, framing this exact moment as a rare, fleeting opportunity to lock in lasting protections before the political landscape potentially shifts. And, of course, doing all this legal work requires funding. The campaign asks its supporters to become monthly donors at a very specific, very intentional tier, $17.76. See what they did there? This perfectly ties their call to action right back to that historical premise we talked about at the very beginning of the explainer. The amount, obviously referencing the year the Declaration of Independence was signed, is framed as this powerful symbolic commitment to defend religious liberty for the next 250 years. They argue that freedom, declared back in 1776, isn't just a given. It has to be actively defended by every single generation. To really wrap up their campaign message, the source material prominently features this quote from President Donald J. Trump: "We are defending our rights and restoring our identity. We are one nation under God, and we always will be." This quote perfectly encapsulates the ultimate cultural ethos driving the First Liberty campaign. It ties all those individual legal battles, the crucifixes, the Sunday Sabbaths, the football prayers, to a much, much broader argument about American identity itself. So as we barrel toward 2026, it leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to think about. As modern society continues to evolve, how in the world will the American legal system balance these deeply held historical convictions with a rapidly changing cultural landscape? Well, that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.